Welcome chess friends. In this video we're going to look at Rook Endgames, Rook plus pawn against Rook, with the pawn on the 7th, 6th or 5th rank and with the attacking king in front of the pawn. Of course you all know the Lucena position and the Philidor, but do you know how to defend against it? And do you know what are the exceptions and alternative ways to defend? So you will learn that. I learned a lot from preparing this video, so I hope you do too. And at the end there are some exercises which will make it possible for you to actively train this theory. And an important inspiration was the 100 Endgames You Must Know and the 100 Endgames You Must Know workbook, Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. And we'll be going through the exercises from those books. So this is the standard position, right? And you're all familiar with how to win this position. Rook g1, king h7, right? Now the king can come forward, but first we bring up the rook to the 4th rank. So later this rook can interpose the checks of the black rook and win the game. So this is building a bridge and the Lucena position. Rook g1 followed by rook g4 and then bringing up the king and interposing with rook e4, and black cannot stop the promotion. So let's see what happens, and we see that the rook is on a2, right? And there are 3 files between the rook and the king on e8. So black can make a draw here by checking, and the white king cannot approach the rook, because then the pawn would be lost on e7. So this is the way to make a draw, checks from the side, and it's the long side with 3 files in between. So normally in the theory, right, you see that the rook is on d2, but you saw now that if you're on the defensive side, the only way to make a draw is actually to have the rook on a2. But of course, it is clear that white wins in this case, in the way we already saw before, with a rook lift to the 4th rank. So what happens if we move everything 1 file, and now we see that the distance between the black rook on a2 and the king on d8 is 2 files, and now the rook doesn't have enough space and it's a draw. So from a defensive perspective, right, you would also always like with the king to be on the short side and with the king to be on the long side. And you can only make a draw if you can check from the long side. So that is the Lucena and the defense against Lucena. Rook to the 4th rank and defensive checking from the long side with 3 files in between. So let's have a look at this one. So the pawn is on the 6th rank, right? And now of course we see a king in front of the pawn. So black's rook, right, cannot leave the back rank because it will be mate, right? So they cannot play rook a6 in this case because of rook b8 mate. And so white can just bring up their rook, and you can see we have a bishop pawn here, right? And after this we threaten mate, king goes back, we play f7 and we win the game. So with a pawn on the 6th rank and the enemy king again, opposite, right? The black rook has to be very passive, And with the bishop pawn, it's an easy win. But if the rook is already on the 7th rank, we have, you could say, a stalemate trick by playing rook g7 here. So if black were to move and the rook was on the 7th rank, this would end in a stalemate, and if the king goes backwards, then we go here and we obtain the draw for black. So that's the exception. So let's go back to the previous example, right? Here they cannot play, black cannot, if black were to move, they cannot play rook a7 because of mate on b8. So it's too late, and here black is losing immediately after rook b7. But this is an opportunity, right? If you have a rook on the 7th rank, that there is this special stalemate idea. I'll keep that in mind. So in this case, right, we saw that the king is on the other side, right? So the king is on e6 instead of g6, right? So on g6, of course, this king was protected. So if we now play this move, right, rook b7, king f8, right, we cannot force this black king away, and then like we had before with rook f7, rook g7. So, and if white tries to get to the other side, now black has a critical tempo and can play rook a1 and obtain the draw. Right, so if we go back, this is easy win, right, because the pawn is protecting the king, and we can go up, come up, check, king has to go away, check, and f7 wins, right, because the king is shielded from the checks. If we just go two further in this case, right, we cannot do the same, and black can obtain the draw. In this case, we're talking about a knight pawn, and in the case of a knight pawn, there's not enough space for the rook, right, for this maneuver, rook h7 and f7 check. So black just waits, and now the black king just goes in the corner, because we don't want to go here, because that would lose the game. But we can go into the corner and make a draw. So passive defense holds against the knight pawn, but loses against the bishop pawn or a central pawn. So it's just white doesn't have enough space with the G and the B pawn. Okay, so this is called the Philidor position, right? And you will be all familiar with this probably. And the defensive method is rook b6, that's the easiest way. So the white king cannot come forward, and after e6, after the pawn moves forward, we go to the first rank, and then we can start checking the king, and the king cannot hide against the checks, and this becomes a draw. So this is the Philidor position. So we have seen Lucena. We have seen how to defend against the Lucena. We have seen a pawn on the sixth rank, the bishop and the G pawn, and now we are talking about the pawn on the 5th rank. Right? So Karstedt found a draw in this position, right? So the rook is not on the 6th rank. And if white were to play rook e6, rook b6, we revert to the Philidor. But white can play king f6. And now he found this move, rook e1, leading to a draw. And this is the idea, king e6, king f8. Right, and now you can see that the king cannot go to d7 or e7 because then the white pawn on e5 is falling. So that is why it was so critical to go to e1 and not f1 and check the king, because we have to prevent this white king from advancing and then after that advancing the pawn. Right, so there's no progress now for white. Right, so now also the king prevents the advance of the pawn. And now we just return, right? And it's basically we get to the same position. So in this position, right? And just let us show what happens if you play rook f1, king e6, or threatening mate, king f8, check, right? And now you can see, right? In this case, there's king e7. And in the case, right? In this case, there was no king e7. So that is why it's so critical not to allow this advance of the pawn, because now we are too late. And white is winning. Yes, so very important, right? You could say here, let's go back. Black is too late, right? Because black would have liked to have the rook on the 6th rank, didn't achieve it, but Karstedt found an alternative way to make a draw. And to play the critical move, rook e1, after the move king f6, king e6 and revert to the Philidor, king f6, rook e1, and remember that later on the critical thing about this rook e1 is that it prevents king e7 or king d7 because the pawn on d7 is under attack. And that's what we see occurring here after this king has been forced away to g7. Okay, so in this case, right, you can see it's the g pawn. Rook g1 would not work, but we have to go to the long side, and then we get to this defense that we saw before, right? So it's the passive defense against the knight's pawn, and we go to a8, and this is the way to make a draw. If we play rook g1, right, now there's this mating threat, and now this pawn, the rook on g8 is going to support this pawn in the promotion. So now the threat is king h7. So you can see rook g2, king h7, king f7, g6 check, king e7, rook a8, and white is winning. We're getting back to the Lucena. So in this case, right, you have to remember that we have to get back to the situation with this knight's pawn, where we have this passive defense on the back rank. So we have to play here rook a1 and go back, and there's not enough space, we saw, right? If there was a bishop pawn, we had this rook g7 a winning maneuver, but in this case there's not enough space because after rook g7 we go king h8 and there is no progress. Okay, so let's have a look here how you would defend. So this is about kind of recognizing how can you get to one of the positions that we knew. So pause the video and try to solve this by yourself. And think about how can you get to a Philidor position here, or to a, you could say, the Karstedt draw that we saw. And what is the right move, right? And so I hope that you paused it and really thought deeply about how can I get to one of the standard positions. And then, of course, the solution is easy, rook b4, with the idea, right, that we get to this Philidor position, right, if the king returns. Now we can just wait. And then when the pawn goes up, we go to the first rank and we make a draw. So notice, right, that would be logical to say, oh, I'm going behind the pawn. That this is, again, right, you can see it resembles one of the positions where we had to play rook e1 and not rook f1, because we're not preventing king e7, right? And if we had the rook on e1, it would have been a draw. But we cannot, of course, in the starting position go to e1. And we are not preventing the advance of the pawn. And we get to the same losing position. Yes, so very critical. If you look at this position, and this is from Fundamental Chess Endings by Karstedt, that you play rook b4, aiming to go to b6 and get to the Philidor, and not rook f1, because then, all right, if you could play this move, it would be different, but not in this case, and now you are losing. Okay, so let's go to this position. So how can you make a draw here, right? Okay, the threat, of course, is rook you can see this is a bishop pawn, right? So the threat is rook b2, rook b8. So how do we prevent it? Can we make a draw? Yes, by the stalemate idea, right? By playing rook a7. And now it's stalemate, and if we would have played in this position, like rook c6, there's the threat of mate, and now we get to the simple winning position, right? That white is winning. Yes, so this is about recognizing which of the positions we can achieve, right? So if you go to the back rank, you're losing. If you wait on the 6th rank, you're losing. You have to take advantage of this unique opportunity to go for the stalemate trick. Okay, so now we get to some puzzles from the 100 Endgames You Must Know workbook. White to move, what is the result? So what do you think? But you can see, right? The pawn is on the 5th rank, and the rook is kind of awkward, right? Because the rook would be here, it would be different, then we would have a Philidor. But the rook is too close to the pawn, right? So it can be attacked after king a6. And we can see that actually white can win here. Because rook d1, right? King e6. Again, right? It's like black cannot prevent in the future. The advance of the pawn. And now after rook d7, rook a1, king e7, right? We can again see the win for the white side. Yes. Yes, and it's very critical, right? We just go back, so king f5 is winning. And right, if black would try to wait, then there's king f6 winning, right? Because now after rook a6 there would be e6. And king e6 only move, king f8, check, forcing the king further away, and now it's very important to play rook d7, because after rook a7 there would be rook e1 and we would have a Karstedt. Yes, so let's go to the next one. Right, so in this case, can you still make a draw? Yes, I mean with rook f1, king d6, and now rook e1, right? So this is the moment. And you can see this king cannot go to d7 or e7 because then the pawn is falling. So we are just in time behind the pawn to make a draw. And after rook e8, rook a1, right, we get to the long side and we can start checking and make a draw. Okay. So sometimes, right, you have to think like, okay, how is this going to change over time, right? So in this case, right, I mean, white is going to give up their f4 pawn and win the g6 pawn. And then where do I want to have this king, on f8 or g8? Well, if the king is on g6, right, we have a g pawn with the king in front. And we know that we can make a draw with passive defense if we get this rook to f8. So knowing that, right, if you look at this position and you have to choose between king f8 and king g8, now you know that the way to make a draw, based on all the theory we have done, has to be king g8, and that king f8 is probably losing, right? So the idea, of course, in this game between Kempinski and Arismendi is this, and black has constructed the back rank defense, right? And then there's no progress here to be made. And a draw was agreed. Yes, there's not enough space to force the king away. So king f8, right? King f6. And now black cannot reach the back rank defense. And you can see, right, you can say, oh, but I can play this. But of course, this is too late because white promotes their pawn. This is the first example. Okay, Eriksson against Rissanen. Black to move. Can black hold the game? So the rook is already behind the pawn, right? And so to reach one of the basic positions, right, there's only one move that makes a draw. Can you find it, right? And that's king c8. King c6, king b8, right? So we go to the short side. And there's no progress, right? So if we would play here rook c2 and wait like this, king c6, okay. Rook c1, wait, and now the king is on this side, and we play rook c8, and this rook, right, allows white to play on the next move. King b7 followed by c6 with a win. So black's king is on the long side where the rook should be. So this is so we always try to get the king on the short side. Okay, next example. Black to move, can black win the game? All right, so here we have a situation, right? So we recognize it. This is a knight's pawn with the king in front. And the white king, right? If the white king would be, and the white rook would be on e1, it would be a draw. But this rook is awkward, right? And you can see that black can win here by playing rook a3, because white is just too late in getting to a back rank defense. I mean, if they could play rook f1 here, it would be a draw, but that's not possible. So this is Minkowicz against Blackburn with black, right? And so black went on to win this game this position. And in the end, it took black a little bit of time, Blackburn, right? But in the end, now we get to the classic position, right? And so now, finally, right, we have the Lucena. So Blackburn didn't do it in the minimum amount of moves, and the king comes up, and black is winning. Yes, so you can see again, right, recognizing that in this position, white is too late for the back rank defense, and after rook a3, right, this king can be forced out of from the back rank, and we reach the Lucena position, and then we can win it by bringing the rook to the right rank and converting. Okay, this is Leonid Stein against Samuel Revesky in 1968. Black to move. Does it make a difference if black plays king d8 or king b8? Well, you know what the principle is, right? You have to go to the short side, right? So king b8, rook h8, king a7, rook d8, and rook c2. And again, right, you would like to play king d7 or king d6. So this was this Karstedt defense. And now, again, preventing the move c6. And it was a draw. So after king d8, right, we can again see this very crucial move, rook c8, right? And on the next move, king b7. And then if king d7, we play c6. And we win the game, and we get to the Lucena position eventually. Yes, so very, very important principle. Last example. Okay, would be very easy for you. Does black have a defense? Yes, and you can say, oh, but this pawn is on the 4th rank, right? Yes, there's only one move to make a draw here, and that's, of course, this back rank defense, right? Even if the pawn is here, it doesn't really matter, right? And just black is waiting. So, right, I mean, it could be that black says, let me try this, right? But now you cannot return anymore, right? If you would return, then it's too late, right? It's too late. So if you would go here, right? You wait. Now the king already can go up immediately. And we get to a winning position, right? So this was Behrens against Rodriguez in 2011, right? And white is using the Lucena to win the game. Excellent. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something from it. So we looked at king and rook against king, rook, and pawn with the attacking king in front of the pawn, and we started with the 7th rank, Lucena, how to defend against the Lucena. Then we went to the 6th rank and the 5th rank and the Philidor position, and we learned about Karstedt, and we looked at some specific cases. If you like this video, please subscribe, and I hope to see you back. And thank you all for watching.